All of us, I'm sure, watched with enormous excitement the events that occurred in the Arab world over the course of 2011 as long-standing dictatorships and authoritarian regimes fell one by one. And in the aftermath of these events, of course, we all took note as political forces with varying degrees of connection to Islam scored phenomenal political successes at the ballot box in both Tunisia and in Egypt. Groups associated with the Muslim Brotherhood and that overall ideological orientation, such as Ennahda in Tunisia, as well as the phenomenal success of some groups of a more Salafi orientation. This has prompted a lot of debate and discussion about the implications of the rise of Islamic social and political movements in the region, a set of questions, inevitably, about the appropriate relationship between religion and politics in public life. And a lot of that discussion has tended to focus on specific actors and movements. Certain figures such as the Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt, Mohammed Morsi, the policies that will be pursued by the Muslim Brotherhood itself, the vision that parties like Al-Noor and also Ennahda in Tunisia have. But I think there's been less attention paid to a broader set of intellectual debates that have been driven by some of the key scholars and thinkers that are associated with these movements. In other words, we've been talking a lot about personalities and parties, but not necessarily so much about the bigger intellectual debates that are taking place in the background of these. And that's really our focus today, is to help you understand the very diverse and crowded ideational landscape in the Middle East around these issues today. And of course, to walk us through this terrain, we have someone probably uniquely qualified to do so. Dr. Jasser Auda is currently an associate professor and deputy director of the Center of Islamic Legislation and Ethics in Doha, Qatar. He has lectured widely throughout the Muslim world on contemporary issues relating to Islamic ethics and jurisprudence. He sits on and is affiliated with a wide variety of scholarly bodies and associations. In his own right, however, he's also something of an intellectual pioneer, as one of the leading figures globally in the development of the maqasid approach to the study of shari'ah. The term shari'ah is generally translated into English as Islamic law. It's a translation that I personally have always had some problem with, and so Jasser's work first came to my attention as someone who also had some quibbling with that precise translation. His work is founded on a tradition that's been present in one way or another over a number of centuries in the thinking around Islamic jurisprudence, which suggests that the term Sharia is best understood not as a legal code, but rather to refer to the idea of an ethical system, the ethics of Islam, and the idea of focusing not on the actual letter of the law or principle, but rather the aims or the objectives of a particular ethical principle. And what he's done in his work, and I'm sure that some flavor of that will work its way into the presentation he makes today, is to mine this tradition of a maqasid orientation to the study of Sharia, to allow us to understand and draw linkages between universalist conceptions of human rights and the possibility of engaging and talking about these kinds of concepts in the Islamic tradition. So he's not just a reliable tour guide around a set of intellectual debates in the Middle East, but also I think is someone who's doing pioneering intellectual work on his own right. So enough from me. Without further ado, let me hand over to Dr. Auda and ask you to join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. for your encouraging words and your kind introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here and to finally get to speak with and meet with the people who are involved in this endeavor at George Mason University. Through Peter and our friendship and our talk, I've been up to date with how the center here develops, and I have such an admiration to the way it is developing and the way it covers areas in the American need in Islamic studies that are not covered by other very prominent places in this area and in America. But there is a uniqueness for this program that I really admire. The topic of shari'ah and state and politics is a long story. And it's a topic of the kind that you can approach from different perspectives. Sometimes we look for the light, or we look for the thing that we're missing in the wrong place. And sometimes we need to look at the politics to understand something. Sometimes we need to look at Sharia or Islamic discourses, theology, in order to understand something. And sometimes we need to look at the social sides and the reality on the ground of the people. And policy cannot be successful unless it combines all of this. It cannot just look at the political players and people who are in power, because from my perspective, the Arab Spring, and again between quotes anyway, until we see what's going to go on, the Arab Spring has changed the game in the Middle East. There is a new player in the Middle East which is called the people, a-Sha'b. And that player, a-Sha'b, is obviously making major changes that some other players were not able to make. A-Sha'b yurid isqat al-nizam. The people want the regime down. And some of the regimes actually fall, and some of the regimes have the little dynamics of trying to resist the falling, but then when they fall, what's going to come up? Is it a different regime? And yes, it might be different people with different ideologies, but what is going to change really on the ground and in the people's lives? The people who are originally the mover and shaker now in the Middle East, who demanded the fall of the previous regimes. So what happened in the Middle East could be best understood as a mixture between the politics and the theology in the recent while, as well as the other dimensions too. But what happened is that the people demanded the fall of the regime in a number of countries. There is a regime change that happened in a few countries so far, and it is perceived that some other countries are underway due to the dynamics and the way things are happening there. And then the people largely chose Islamic groups or Islamic parties or people with Islamic orientation. To the shock and surprise of many of the leaders of these Islamic parties and many of the activists of the Islamic parties. Some of these parties existed 6 months before the election. And before these 6 months, democracy for them was kufr. In English is heresy. Democracy is heresy. And until they went to the elections, their spokespersons, for example, I have to give some examples with no offense, just to survey. For example, Sheikh Abdul Mun'im al-Shahat, who ran for elections for the Noor Salafi party, and he was asked during the election campaign, how come you run for election and democracy is haram, democracy is forbidden, as you said before the revolution? He said, no, democracy is not forbidden. Democracy is kufr. Democracy is a heresy. They told him, okay, how come then you run for election? He said because it's means to an end. What is the end? The end is to create an Islamic state. But that is one streak of a large spectrum, a large number of streaks there that form a whole spectrum. And as Peter said, it is a complex picture that if you would like to be serious about and to give the right advice that you feel comfortable and peaceful and you could sleep at night about, then you need to put a lot of effort in order to understand the complexity of what's happening there. There are different propositions for what boiled down to the question of the relation between what's called the dini and what's called the madani, the religious and the civil. This is how the debate is framed. For example, in today's Tunisia or today's Egypt, which are the 2 points that are leading the debate really and leading the way in the Arab revolutions. What is the relationship between the religious, the Islamic that is, especially with Islamic governments and people who are leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood who are ruling these countries now, and what's called the civil, or what turned out to be called the civil. And the civil, or al-Madani, is a terminology that is used by people in different ways. It could mean something that you could identify with in your mind as civil, and it could mean something that you would be shocked to know that people call this civil. But let's assume that there are 2 circles, the circle of civil and the circle of religious or Islamic, and how the debate is going between these 2 circles. There is the liberal proposition, people who call themselves liberal. Some call themselves secular, but secular has kind of a bad name in the Arab public, and therefore they call themselves liberal, who preached the separation of the religious and the civil. They said that if we're talking about 2 circles, the religious and the civil are 2 circles with no area of overlap. There is a total separation between anything that has to do with religion, Islam, Christianity, any other religion, and anything that has to do with civil in the sense of public affairs, in the sense of government, state. There is a total separation there. And you find people calling for the annulment of things that have Islamic or Christian components in them, such as the family law, for example, in Egypt or Tunisia. Some parties in Tunisia called for the annulment of the family law, part of which is based on the Islamic law, or shari'ah, which I will also explain. Islamic ethics, let's put it this way. And then they wanted to convert Tunisia into a civil state in which everything is related to the state on the basis of equal citizenship and equal status of everybody. And therefore, they wanted to legitimize every form of marriage that is in Tunisia, including marriage of siblings, including marriage of whatever you could think of. I've seen that on TV and some political campaigns before the Tunisian elections. That's the latest one. And I was shocked in the sense that this is not how the society thinks. This is very alien to the society. Yet, this is one extreme, one color in the spectrum that is on the left, if you wish, or the right, or whatever it is. So there is one color. There is another extreme, which is often given by people who call themselves Salafi parties or Salafi groups. And if you look at the theology of Salafism, and that's a dimension that is very important, it is not different from the theology of most Muslims. It is, to believe in God and one God and the oneness of God and Muhammad, and to follow the Prophet and his example and so on. And the only difference perhaps is that they don't follow the schools of jurisprudence as closely as some other people follow. But people don't follow the schools of jurisprudence anyway, the public, that is. Schools of jurisprudence is something that you study in a faculty of Sharia. So theologically speaking, they are not very different from the rest. But the difference, I would say, is just in the apparent look and in the political ideology. The apparent look, the longer your beard is, the more Salafi you are. With all respect, I'm just trying to classify here. This is not a lecture in theology, it's a lecture in classification, in order to understand. And the shorter your thobe would get, you know, if it gets to the knee, right under the knee, that is your Islamic robe, then this is very strict, and then it goes down. And then, of course, you have to have a hat for men, and you probably have to cover your face for women, etc. That is a Salafi approach. The ideology is quite extreme, but very similar to many of the other Islamic groups when it comes to the ideology towards the West. If you ask about the question of women in Islam, if you ask about the question of Israel, if you ask, like, it is an ideology, it's a very typical Islamist ideology. Yet it is the apparent look and the show that is put in order for the group to be classified as Salafi, really. Like sometimes in a very funny way, and in a very non-Arab, non-Egyptian, non-Tunisian, a way that does not belong to that culture. Like, for example, some of the advertisements of the Salafi female candidates for parliament actually did not show the picture of that Salafi woman. It showed a picture of her husband, you know, and it said, elect the wife of so-and-so, and so on. And so when you see these things in the street, you feel, of Cairo, for example, you feel very like, what is going on? This is not the Egyptian culture. But, and the Salafi movements found their allies outside Egypt who could fund that huge campaign over 6 months or 9 months in order for them to win 25% of the vote. I would say that the liberal trends also tried to find allies, yet liberalism in the Arab world usually comes with Arab nationalism and comes with things that not everybody in the liberal world would like to fund, you know, so there is complexity here. So there is lack of fund, serious lack of fund, because of the national stance. In the Salafi category that I'm trying to define, the religious circle and the civil circle are identical. So basically, everything in the religion has to transform and translate into something in the state. And therefore, every sin is a crime, and every obligation is a law, including the very basic moral obligations. We're talking about countries that are models of that, such as Saudi Arabia, for example, in which every sin is a crime. Somebody who's not praying, that's a crime. Somebody who is not covering in the way that the dominant school of jurisprudence preaches in that country, it becomes a crime. And so forth. Any indecent behavior is a crime. Not just a sin that is forbidden in the Islamic ethical code, but a crime in the sense that you have the police who will come after you and arrest you, you pay a fine or get lashed or whatever it is, that's the punishment for transgressing the borders of sins. The other side of the spectrum is trying to look at these two circles as identical circles, and like, unfortunately or surprisingly, this trend won 25% of the Egyptian parliament and had quite a say in the events of the previous few months. There are different approaches to the civil and the religious that try to find a compromise between both. And within that compromise, they had to do some theology. They had to start to be creative about how they can be Islamic and at the same time civil. You find that some groups, or let's say the Muslim Brotherhood in the original pre-first election proposals, was saying that we don't need to differentiate between the Islamic state and the civil state, because an Islamic state is a civil state by definition. Not the other way around. Not the civil state is an Islamic state by definition. You're talking about the Islamic state is a civil state by definition. How is it a civil state by definition? Because people are equal in front of the law and so forth. What about the question of non-Muslims, Copts in Egypt, for example? There were different answers at that point. The answers, some of them were saying that they have to pay the non-Muslim tax and not join the army, and some of the answers were saying that they are equal citizens, but they cannot be a president, and some of the answers were doing different exceptions. And there has been quite a labor and quite a struggle with some of these questions over the past 2 years until what we see today, which is quite different. I will explain. So basically, the two circles, again, coinciding or overlapping totally, with no exception, except for a few spots that you could consider exceptions in Islam. And then you have within the Muslim Brotherhood different streams of thought. And the streams were always there, but the revolution kind of brought the streams out. One of the streams had to do with a definition of the Islamic State that is very close to the liberal definition. And I'm talking about classes within the Muslim Brotherhood, very close to the liberal definition except for the family law. So they say that the family law has to remain Islamic, but everything else has to be just the national interest of Egypt, and they take liberties in a lot of the Islamic details and so on. These tend to be the younger folks who participated in the revolution, and many of them who sacrificed in the revolution, despite the fact that they were giving the green light to work in the revolution, and eventually on the 28th of January asked to participate. Yet the dynamics of their participation in the revolution was very different from the usual Islamic thought that was proposed by the group pre-revolution. The youth of the revolution, who are closer to the liberal ideas, eventually left the group and eventually are forming, in turn, a number of trends themselves. Some of them, or many of them, joined Abu al-Futuh's campaign, for those who are familiar with the Egyptian politics, and then eventually are working on Masr al-Qawiyya, or the Strong Egypt Party. Some of them joined with the more liberal forces and are forming Al-Tayyar al-Masri, or the Egyptian Stream. And some of them continued to struggle from within the group for a more national understanding of a state that is not Islamic in the historical sense, is not really differentiating between citizens based on their religion. Then eventually, under the pressure of the presidential elections, shifts started to happen in the stance towards the Islamic State. What happened is that there was an obvious intention for the election or the presidential election to be a setback in the revolution. And that intention could not have been diverted or reversed without the unification of all streams in the Egyptian society. Let's focus on the Egyptian example now. And streams of the Egyptian society, in order for them to unite, they had to agree on a common ground. And that is when the liberals started to buy into some Islamic ideas in their thought, and that's when the Islamists started to give up some of the ideas of specific rules to their purposes or their objectives or principles. Al-Azhar, at that time and before, played a role in that, particularly in Egypt. It is an ancient university, but quite a moderate view on Islam, by declaring that the source of legislation that has to be in the new constitution is not the rules of the Sharia, but rather the purposes of the Sharia. And the departing from the ahkam to the maqasid, the departing from the rules to the purposes, is quite a depart. Perhaps you might not appreciate it if you're not familiar with the Islamic jargon. But, for example, the tax that you take from non-Muslims as an Islamic state, if you look at the rules, then, well, the letter of the Quran is talking about this tax, jizya, and the letter of the prophetic tradition had implied that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ had taken jizya. His companions afterwards had done that, and kharaj and all of that, and a number of forms, But then if you look at the tradition, then you will stop at the letter of what happened. If you go from the letter to the purpose, then we are talking about why the jizya was part of the Islamic law to start with, and the purpose was to protect non-Muslims who are not part of the Islamic army. And therefore, the argument would go, if they are today part of the Islamic army, then they don't need to pay that tax because everybody is part of the same army. Everybody is part of the national army. And therefore, it was equal citizenship, really. The principle of equal citizenship is the game changer here. When the Islamic groups agreed, or some of them, I think most of the Salafi streams still don't agree on equal citizenship. But when the Islamic groups agreed to equal citizenship, this was a game changer, because they realized that because everybody is an equal citizen, then everybody will be part of the army, and therefore we can justify the change of the rule from an Islamic point of view. And scholars who are theorists for these groups and have quite a say in the Arab world, such as the scholars of the International Union of Muslim Scholars, Sheikh Al-Qaradawi and Sheikh bin Bayya and Sheikh Rashid al-Nushi and others, when they issued these fatwas or these statements saying that, yes, it could be the case that all the citizens are treated equally because protection is given by everybody equally. Therefore, the part that is the jizya is not part of the proposals now for an Islamic state or for a civil state. A term emerged that is a very interesting term, that is now the reference for everybody who is trying to take a middle path between the secularists, liberals, and the Salafi extremists or literalists. It is a civil state with an Islamic reference, Dawla Madaniyya Marja'iyya Islamiyya. And I know that it is a very funny combination of words for a political scientist, which I am not, but I saw the reaction of many political scientists on that. What is a civil state with an Islamic reference? What do you mean by that? that invention, I think, was very important in these steps and evolution of events that I'm trying to outline here quickly in a big picture. Because once you're talking about a civil state, then you are talking about equal citizenship. And therefore, you allow non-Muslims to be president, you allow women to be judges, you allow everybody equal financial rights and financial obligations towards the state, etc., etc. And therefore, you have a kind of state that is not necessarily a Western secular state, but something that is very close to that, since I'm talking to a Western audience here. So therefore, but with an Islamic reference, guaranteed a few things in the law and in the structure of the state that the majority of people, I would say, would ask for. It guaranteed the part that has to do with the family law, for example. In any given voting, or if you ask people, including those who call themselves secularists or liberals, if they want a civil marriage law, they would not agree to that because they would like to refer to their religion, the Copts, Muslims. Yet, the reference to the religion also, I have to put between brackets, requires a lot of ijtihad, a lot of renewal, a lot of work, which is also happening. It started during the time of Mubarak. After the revolution, many people said, let's annul all of these Suzanne laws, Mubarak's wife's laws. But now, no, this is a trend that is reversed now. Everybody agrees now to Suzanne's laws, and they want to even go ahead with more reform towards more rights for women and so on. For those who don't know, one of these rights, for example, was divorce rights, which is very significant. Before the 1990s, women in Egypt, for example, did not have divorce rights, you can imagine, and so forth. So the civil state with an Islamic reference is a term that is emerging, and that I think is a very promising term in order to develop a new concept of a state in that part of the world that cannot be a copy of other concepts of states, because this doesn't work. You have to bring out the concept of state from the people's culture and the people's feeling of identity and so forth. You cannot write a constitution that is copied from any European country or African non-Muslim majority country or whatever. However advanced it is, it doesn't work, because you have to have politics that represent the people. Remember, the people have to be happy because the people have changed the regime, and every power since then, from the generals of the army into other people who assume different power roles, had discovered that they cannot fool the people anymore. They can fool them a little bit, but not as much as before the revolutions. It's not going to happen that they create a dictatorship in the name of a certain family or in the name of a certain whatever. And the people push a lot and go to the streets, turn out in great numbers if any attempt of returning to dictatorship starts to appear. Like, for example, the Islamic proposal that the state should take care of morality in the society is something that is overwhelmingly rejected by the people, because people do not want the state to watch over their personal behavior anymore, because now they know that a state like that is a dictatorship. And a state with a big enough police to watch over every kid in the street, what he or she is doing, is a state that is too big to tame or to remove or to change. And therefore, there is more and more awareness of the necessity of diminishing the role of the state, really, to put it in political terms, and decreasing the size of the state, again, to put it in political terms. And the politicians have been reacting to that. Now there is talk about freeing the religious institution altogether, Al-Azhar, etc., from the state, from being appointed by the president, to being an independent, democratically elected institution. Al-Azhar, before the revolution of Nasser, was independent in the sense of relying on those endowments or foundations. And the foundations or endowments are totally civil. Again, they are totally away from the government. But civil at that time was opposed by the military rather than the religious. It was before the civil-military struggle. Now it is the civil-religious struggle. So during the days, and hopefully they are gone, of the civil-military struggle, the military took over the endowments and canceled people financing any public institutions in order for them to control the institutions. And that's how they controlled Al-Azhar and the scholars and the mosques and whatever over that long. Now there is talk about elections in Al-Azhar and having an independent religious body that represents the scholars. And giving more independence to that body, in my perspective, guarantees more moderation and guarantees more progress and advancement in the Islamic reasoning. There is more talk now about cancelling altogether the Ministry of Information, this ministry that controls the media and controls how people receive information. So there is more proposals now about there is no need for a Ministry of Information. Let's have media bodies that are independent, between quotes. They're not, obviously, but at least they are not dependent on the government that is elected or now elected, and so forth. So the civil state with an Islamic reference is an entry point to a lot of developments that could happen in that part of the world, and I think that has to be encouraged. The spectrum, as I said, is quite a complex spectrum, and there is more details into the different propositions of a civil state and so forth. But now it boils down to kind of two circles that have an intersecting area, an area of intersection. This area of intersection now is the family law, which is run in parallel laws. Perhaps you don't know this in the United States, or you haven't experienced that, but the Islamic majority part of the world had experienced parallel laws all along, and from the beginning, in fact, during the time of Muhammad, peace be upon him, the Jews of Medina had their law and the Muslims had their law. So said the document that he wrote. So, and the family law is an expression of parallel laws, and there could be some discussion about that and the soundness of this idea. I don't see why not. I'm not talking about America, by the way. I'm talking about over there. I know that there's a lot of debate on Sharia in this part of the world, but the debate of Sharia over there is also politically charged, but not as politically charged as it here. It's just a word that people use anyway. So basically, that area of intersection so far is the family law, and is the role that the state plays in some of, let's say, the spiritual acts of worship of Islam, like pilgrimage and the state institutions that overlook the memorization of the Quran and so forth. There are certain things that belong to the Islamic acts of worship rather than the Islamic acts of dealing, which are two different chapters in the Islamic ethics. The acts of worship have to do with individual freedoms of worship. So the government still sponsors that and will continue to. And there is a general consensus for example, in Egypt over that, not as much in Tunisia. Yet the government is sponsoring the acts of worship. Yet the acts of dealing, or the civil part of the state, is now out in the political decision kind of area. Of course, there is always apologism. When a loan is taken, the loan is usury. So you get into some apologetic kind of discourse that, well, it is usury, but it is a darura, it is a necessity, and so forth. So there is always a way of justifying political decisions from an Islamic point of view. And it is acceptable in the Islamic point of view to justify political decisions that are different from the letter of the script. And that happened all along in the Islamic history. And we're starting to see more of this now. Justifying political decisions that are taken hopefully for the best of the country or for the well-being of the people, and justifying it through an Islamic discourse. But we have to differentiate between the discourse and what is really happening in terms of politics. What is really happening in terms of politics is usual politics, even with a Muslim Brotherhood president. We are talking about the usual Egyptian politics. The difference is that it is not usual in the sense of serving the president and his children and stuff. It is usual in the sense of serving the people, whom the president is supposed to be governing. And therefore, I think the well-being of the people is starting to get more and more attention. Of course, this links directly to the question of economics, and economics so far is to the right. I'm aware of being here in America, but I would love to see, as an Egyptian too, I'd love to see economics that are more to the left. That is something that many of the neo-Muslim Brotherhood are actually proposing in their new parties, and so forth. So there are interesting dynamics that are happening in the development of that, but I do hope I was able to draw kind of a picture of the spectrum and some of the nuances and complexities. I would go on and on, but I would like to really engage into a discussion. Perhaps I could answer some of your questions. But I could go on and on about the complexities there is. My general advice, please don't judge the Middle East in a simplistic manner. It is a very complex part of the world. Every country is a very complex piece of history, a piece of society. And if you are going to be involved in policy and so on, it is a serious responsibility to educate yourself and immerse yourself in that culture in order to understand what you're talking about, because you end up making decisions and taking measures that affect millions of lives that are as precious as your own life. And thank you so much.